We have one more chapter to look at, then we'll stop, and you can ask your big thought questions, because what you have dealt with is John's gospel, like like most Catholics haven't, and and it's like, wow, this is really different. It's really beautiful, but it's also different, and we'll talk about that. Huh? So chapter 21. Most scholars see chapter 21 as an appendix, a second ending, that there were more stories that survived of Jesus and in the Johannine community, and so these were added. And they're dealing with one particular matter, and that is the relationship between the beloved disciple and Peter. Okay? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, particularly in Matthew and Luke, Peter is clearly the head of the gang. In John, he's not. What do we have here? Is it two views of the same thing, or is it maybe two different ways of being church? I'll cut to the chase. The brightest scholars in this regard suggest it's just that the Johannine gospel comes out of a group of Christians for whom the witness that really matters is the beloved disciple. That he is their apostle. He is the one who founded them. Yeah, Simon Peter's out there, but it was the beloved disciple. That's their name for him. They're the one who named him the beloved disciple. And remember how every time Simon Peter and the beloved disciple line up together, who wins? It's always the beloved disciple. So as Christianity spread, it wasn't uniform. They didn't have the catechism, we'll do it this way. And as the apostles spread out, one of them, who is remembered as the beloved disciple, founded a church community. Tradition says that the author, the evangelist, did his work in what we call Asia, Mount Ephesus, where Paul, remember, had visited, huh? And if you go to Ephesus, there are churches dedicated to John there. And there is a house that a visionary said was Mary's house, where the beloved disciple took Mary after Jesus' death. So there's that tradition in the church. It's beyond the scripture, but that's remembered there. So what we have here is the church, the Johannine community, which is a kind of Christianity, and then there's what we'll call the synoptic community, and we've already seen, we've only read two of the Gospels, Mark and Luke, but we see how they tell the same story. So there's two different bodies of Christianity, and how do they relate to each other? Well, not always well, but chapter 21 suggests that in the end, they came together. And this chapter is defining that coming together. Okay? So, it begins with another appearance of Jesus. It happens in Galilee. Now, I told you, in John's Gospel, in the original John's Gospel, all the appearances happen in Jerusalem. Again, this is the appendix. Huh? This is a second ending, an addition. And where are the disciples? They're in Galilee, and what are they doing? They're going back fishing. Now, did they lose? Was it a Sunday afternoon and they had nothing to do? But when they fish, they're not going for relaxation. They got nets. They're fishing for a livelihood. Okay, this is not something you do for fun. Did they go back to their old life? So notice they get in the boat, and Thomas is there, Simon Peter's there, the sons of Zebedee. And who are the sons of Zebedee? James and John. So again, tradition assumed that John, the son of Zebedee, is the author. A little tension here, because later on, when somebody in the boat recognizes Jesus, and he's called the beloved disciple, is that John? It could be, but would that it was clear to us, but it's not. So anyway, they're out fishing, all right? Meanwhile, Jesus is on shore, and he calls out to them, "Children, have you any fish?" They shout back, no. He tells them where to drop the net. There's a story much like this, there was, in Luke 5, remember? After Jesus is preaching from the boat, he asks Simon to push out, and then he says, drop the net, and Simon says, Lord, I've done all night, go ahead. And that's when Simon collapses in the boat, and then Jesus calls him and says, you're going to be fishers of men. Okay, so there's a kind of a connection here in some sort. So Jesus from the shore calls out. They don't recognize him. Again, remember, that's the motif. They don't recognize him. Now, you could say, well, maybe he was too far out. Granted, but they don't recognize him. They drop the net, and they catch a huge a huge bunch. Okay? Verse 7, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. One more time, the beloved disciple trumps Simon Peter. But then Peter plunges off the boat, putting clothes on. It's kind of odd, but you put your clothes on and get in the water, but he does, out of respect, I guess. And the others bring the fish on shore, 153. Now, scholars spend a lot of time worrying about this. If you're a math major, do you know what a prime number is? Like 5 prime is 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. So the prime of 17 is 153. So whatever the number is. So so what does that say? I don't know what it says. There's lots of scholarly and preacherly suggestions, but nobody knows why the number is mentioned. So it's open. It's wide open. You can solve that puzzle and get your PhD. Verse 9, when they got on land, they saw a charcoal fire. Remember I told you earlier? Where did charcoal appear earlier? Peter, in the courtyard. That was the scene of his triple defection. And so charcoal fire, no accident, will be the scene of his triple redemption. This is the first breakfast. We had the Last Supper. This is the first breakfast. Jesus feeds them. Before they bring the fish that they caught, Jesus already had the breakfast set. He has bread and he has fish, and they eat. Okay? Verse 14. This is now the third time Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Again, that could be a full stop, but it's not. After lunch, Jesus leaves the other disciples to take care of the dishes, and Jesus says to Simon, come follow me. And so they go for a walk on the seaside, and Simon is asked, do you love me more than these? Now the these includes the beloved disciple. And Simon famously says, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus says, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus asks the question. Again, Simon says, yes, Lord. And again, Jesus says, tend my sheep. A third time in verse 17, Jesus asks, it says, Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? He said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you girded yourself and walked where you would. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish to go. So it speaks about Peter's future and Peter's death. Okay? In fact, the narrator says, this was said to show by what death he was to glorify God. And then Jesus repeats the original, follow me, from the other Gospels. Okay? Now, here's where the Johannine disciple, the beloved disciple, comes along. Peter turns, following them, the disciple whom Jesus had loved, who had lain close to his breast at the supper, and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? Okay, so the author here feels the need to remind us who the beloved disciple is. Peter says, what about him? What about him? Jesus said, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Okay, that's the end of Jesus' conversation. But here the narrator steps up and says, the saying spread abroad among the brethren that the disciple was not to die. That is, that Jesus was going to come back before he died. Okay? Yet Jesus did not, but again, the narrative, but Jesus didn't say that. That's just what people said. Okay, so you catch that? So what do you suppose has happened? But that prompted the author to add this chapter. The beloved disciple did die. Okay? That there was a rumor, a talk, expectation based on this conversation that the beloved disciple wasn't going to die. Okay? But now he evidently has died. So this addition to the text is added to solve that explanation. To say, you guys are wrong when you thought that. That's not what Jesus said. Okay? Verse 24. Here's the final ending. This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things. So the one who, the disciple. He is the one who is bearing witness. I told you, for this community, it is the beloved disciple who is their link to Jesus. He is their apostle. And who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Now, that's a good ending. It's not as big as the chapter 20 ending, which explains why he was writing. But, again, this is anchoring this very different view of Jesus in the testimony of the beloved disciple who is this church's leader, is their apostle. Okay? So scholars propose that this kind of episode is what brings a unity between, or brings to unity the synoptic church, the Petrine church, or they call it the apostolic church of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Johannine church, or the beloved disciple. That over time, they melded together. And that brought the fourth gospel into the church. And the Johannine Christians began to recognize Simon Peter as a force to be reckoned with. Okay? Look at your textbook. Number 28. The supplementary reading, 28. Raymond Brown is the author of the slim blue-gray commentary on John that you have. He authored 3 massive, 1,000 pages each, volumes on the Gospel of John and the letters of John. He died about 20 years ago. He's Catholic. He was one of the premier. I mean, just wow. Anyway, this little chart here is his attempt to tell the history of the Johannine community. And I'll give you a summary of it. This comes from his big fat book called The Community of the Beloved Disciple. Phase 1 is the creation of the original church, the Johannine church, which was influenced by Samaritans and by Gentile converts. How phase 2, as the gospel was written, these Christians this is when they were being thrown out of the synagogue. They were Jewish Christians, but they were being thrown out of the synagogue. Remember, I made a big deal about that last month. That this community suffered that way. They were Jews in their origin, with some Samaritans and some Gentiles, but they were thrown out of the church, and that became the nucleus of the Johannine community, which, as you're going to read in our next lecture, last lecture today, about the letters of John, broke apart. The first letter talks about they were part of us, now they're not part of us. In fact, the author calls these other people the Antichrist. That's the church split. The Johannine community broke apart. Okay? The letters that we're going to read are testimony to that. One wing of the Johannine community went off to become Gnostics. And the other wing made peace with the great church, the church of the apostles, the church of Peter. The Gospel of John was perceived by the early church with a big question mark because it was so different. And it was like Jesus wasn't really human. I mean, because he doesn't really pray because he's always talking to God. He never asks a question without knowing the question. He's totally in control of his death. So it's like like Jesus' figure in the fourth gospel isn't really human. He's like God beamed down. Okay? There was a word for it. There's many different flavors of Christianity in the beginning. And one heresy, again, that's a heavy term. That's the winners labeling the losers. But one heresy, one view of the church, of Christ, that was not embraced by the church is called Docetism. Docetism. It comes from the Greek word dokein, which means to seem. That Jesus only seemed to be human. Literally, that he was just pretending. Now, I know a lot of Catholics who I think their view of Jesus is that way. He didn't really, he's God. He didn't know anything. He doesn't grow. He doesn't feel any pain. Now, that's not the Catholic Church's vision. But I've met many Catholics who when they talk about Jesus, they kind of talk that way, that he just kind of beamed down and pretended. It's an attempt to hold on to his divinity, but in the process, loses his humanity. Okay? On Sunday, when we stand and profess our creed, pay attention to it. He is totally divine. He is totally human. You don't get to pick and be an Orthodox Catholic or Orthodox Christian at all. He's both. That's what the creed is saying. It blows your mind. It blew the mind of Arius in the early church. Huh? He couldn't get his arms around that. But that's what we profess. That's why we make a big deal about Christmas. It's not Jesus' birthday. We don't know when he was born. It's that God really became human. That's why the Gospel writer Luke says Jesus grew, went home to his disciples, his parents, and he grew in wisdom and age. That's why the letter to Hebrews says Jesus is like us in all things but sin. It's why Jesus in Mark's Gospel says, I don't know when the end of the world is, because they're holding on to his like me. He grew. In some way, he grew, and yet he is divine. That is the church's teaching. And you can see why it's hard to grasp. And so some groups went off this way. Jesus is a wise teacher. Today, in America, for non-church-going people, Jesus is a nice teacher. He loves babies. He tells great stories. Okay? And the other extreme is Jesus is divine, but isn't really human. And the church says, no. It's both and. Both and. And so what Brown has done here is try to hypothesize. This is a hypothesis. This is not anything he can prove of those steps in the process. Now, let's just step back. How does Jesus come off in this gospel? To you. How does Jesus come off in John? If you're going to describe him, what would you say?
He's above the whole thing.
He's above, yeah, he's totally above. What else?
He's very wordy.
Very wordy. And what's he always talking about? Himself. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that, no, gosh, that guy never shuts up. No. But again, for John's community, it was very important. But I want to just describe the character of Jesus. He's from above. He's very wordy. Always talking about himself. He never doubts himself. Never questions himself. Doesn't really show a lot of humanity. He weeps at Lazarus' tomb. That's one little bit. But not a lot of humanity. He's a little bit arrogant. Because he knows everything. Because he's divine. Again, I'm not really attacking Jesus. I'm just saying the characterization of Jesus in John's gospel it's black and white. It's black and white. And if you don't get him, if you don't get on board, what happens? You're gone. You're gone. There's no gray. Now, last time I spoke about, there's nothing like persecution to make you black and white. Okay? Again, they arrested this group, and some of you, would give your lives, and the others wouldn't. Well, those who gave your lives, they pretended to believe, but they really weren't part of us. They were bogus. Huh? Nothing like persecution to draw a division between believers. So, and again, I just want to, and then I'll shut up. You may have questions, but I told you, I think early along, people have their own favorite gospels, and if you like, I love John's gospel, but I could never have gotten to love John's gospel if I didn't love Mark's gospel first. Thank God we have 4 gospels. 4. You don't get to pick your own. It's all 4. And so, as a church, we draw our understanding of Jesus from all 4. If all we had was John's gospel, how do we look at the rest of the world? Us and them. What's going to happen to them? They're done. They are done. Unless they get on board, they're gone. I don't care if they're nice people or philosophers, they're done. Okay? What else? What about our obligation to our neighbor? Who's our neighbor in John's gospel? Others in the church. And nobody else is your brother. Now, that's very different than synoptic. Jesus says, love your neighbors, but he says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Not in John's gospel. You see, it's a different, and so if all we had was John's gospel, oh my gosh, no obligation to our neighbor, to the common good. It's the church. I look out for my own. Now again, I'm not dissing it. I love the gospel, but you've got to read all 4 of them. As Catholics, we take all 4 of them. Not just, we have to take the Jesus who is divine through and through and balance that with the Jesus of Mark, who is divine, but he keeps his finger over his mouth, huh? And doesn't. In John's gospel, what matters is how you respond to Jesus. In the synoptic gospels, there seems to be a little bit of gray. There's room for gray. Not in John. Yes, Peter?
You can kind of see why the Gospel of John is the darling of the evangelical Pentecostal theology.
Very much. Paul and John's gospel, if you listen to TV evangelism, they're the dominant sources they go to. And again, I'm not saying that they invented it and then they found a gospel that matched. It was their reading of and their favoring these gospels that has led them to look at other. So again, I'll raise a practical question, then I will shut up. What does the church teach about those who are not baptized or who don't become Catholic Christians? I would invite you to read the catechism about it to double check this, but here, I'll give you the answer. There are 3 different views you'll find in the world. You will find church communities that say, it doesn't matter. God loves everybody. God's like Santa Claus. Everybody gets a ribbon. We all win. Okay, that's one view. The other view would be, unless you are a Christian, a baptized Christian, maybe who is baptized through immersion or belongs to my church, those are the only people who will see God. Jews, Catholics, Mormons, atheists, all going to hell. Which gives them, which pushes them and prods them to do evangelizing. I mean, they care, and so now, but that's it. It's black and white. The Catholic Church, again, and I invite you to the Catechism, is kind of, yes, Jesus. We know no other way than baptism. Jesus said, "Go teach all nations, baptizing them." We know no other way. Jesus didn't give us any other way. But the Catechism says, "But God is not bound by the sacraments." God is not bound by the sacraments. He may have other ways. For example, we read Romans. Remember Romans chapter 1, where Paul says there are people out there who do not know the law, but it's as if they are a law unto themselves. That is, that they somehow have been, that God's grace has rained on them, and they, to some degree, have though they don't fully understand it or practice it, they're on the road. That's where the Catholic Church stands. That's why we insist on baptism. We know of no other way. But we're not saying God is bound. God may have another way. So you see what the Catholic Church is kind of, it's not exactly with John. And it's not exactly with the Synoptics. It's all of it together. Now, I'll shut up. Who's got questions or comments? Yes, Joanne.
Is there really people who are, I mean, what is really intelligent people know what, but you see John as the Lord of disciples?
Yes.
So is that pretty well out there?
No, for the last 15 centuries, that was the assumption that was made. But it was made in a time when it was really important that it be an apostle that we knew. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, when the church was doing battle with Gnosticism, it needed to, what was its best argument? Our stuff came from the apostles. So it was really important to make all the Gospels written by apostles. That was an argument. My statement is we don't know. I just want to put a question mark. I'm just saying we don't know. Our tradition has jumped on saying that, yes, the little disciple is John. But that's really going beyond what the text says. Now, again, so I call him John. I don't have a, but just, so same with Matthew, we'll get to that. Put a question, we're not quite sure. Just hold your horses. It's not quite clear. Though our earlier ancestors made that determination. They made that association, absolutely. Okay? Yes?
Is that why Paul, even though he has that great, and he explains Jesus and all of that, he's not a doctor, even though he has a lot of good theology in there, because he wasn't there?
That Paul doesn't what?
Well, like Paul claims that he was an apostle because Jesus appeared to him, but he didn't learn all this stuff.
Yeah, one man saying Jesus appeared to me does not rate in most people's minds as much as here was a guy who walked with us for 3 years, and so Paul is singularly saying I had a vision, and people say, well, maybe, so but that's why. But again, Paul is absolutely essential to the church's mission and teaching. But that's why there was some tension. You weren't around when Jesus was here. Now you say you know all about Jesus? Really? So,
Yes, personally, I can't relate it to John that much because he's somewhere there. But my question is, when he became a human, he didn't lose anything? I mean, I don't...
you're asking me, how does the church understand that God became human?
Yeah, so, Matthew or Mark, something, self-empty.
What does that mean? Again, I'll try to leap, and we don't know. That's why it's a mystery. There's a little article that I read that, for me, helps me understand. Again, what the church teaches, you understand. How does the church understand it? The church doesn't understand, doesn't really know how this is. It's beyond us. But here's an example. Let's say I am royalty. Okay, let's say I'm the children of king and a queen. Let's say I'm walking down the street and a brick falls and hits me on the head. And I lose my mind. I lose my memory. I have amnesia. Okay? Now, am I no longer royalty? No, I'm royalty. If my family sees me, they can pick me up, but they'll say, oh no, you're our son. Now, I may not know I'm their son, because I may have lost my memory. But I am. So, one way of, again, this is not from the popes or from the churches, but just that in a sense, what we're trying to say, or one way of thinking about it is, in Jesus, God emptied himself of his self-identity, his memory, became one of us, was born and had been taught how to walk and how to spell, But he continues to be divine. He is the divine one. He's the divine one who was at the beginning of time, but has, for the purposes of our salvation, poured himself out. And then is seeking to rediscover his identity and our identities at the same time. And again, more than that, that's just a way of kind of trying to understand that I cannot remember who I am, but I still am who I am. Does that help at all? Not so much.
So that's why I was asking a long time ago, why did Jesus have to get a baptism? Baptism means the death and then rebirth. So what did he die? You know.
Again, and I said, this is the problem. Why is God being baptized? That's a problem that all the evangelists have to deal with. Mark doesn't seem to be bothered by it, but the others are bothered by it. So, okay, other comments or questions? Yes?
Any insight as to why in post-resurrection appearances these are retained, but not the scourging and not the sawing and...
So you're asking, why does John retain their Easter stories, but not all the details of Jesus' passion and suffering?
No, actually his appearance, Jesus' physical appearance to the disciples, his glorified body.
Yes?
Why are some wounds retained in his... but not everything?
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know that. Why are there not the crown of thorns and why I don't know. The gospel stories only mention the nail marks, the feet, and the wound in the five. That's the 5 wounds of Jesus. If you've seen the Jerusalem cross, there are 5 crosses. That's the 5 wounds of Jesus. Right? Nobody else in the gospel mentions the other marks. I don't know. When you get to heaven, you get to ask that question. Yes, sir.
This is a little off topic, but the Shroud of Turin, what is the Catholics, what's our church's view of it?
The Catholic Church's stance on the Shroud of Turin, it's an object of devotion. The Church has not, to my knowledge, made a definitive judgment on it that you have to buy it or believe it. The Church was party to the testing that was done, and again, the testing seems to not have been definitive, I guess. They tested the cloth, the age of the cloth. And I still don't, there are arguments made for its age, that goes back to the 1st century, but the carbon dating did not go back to the 1st century. So the Church, it's still something that the Church, it's in Turin, it's brought out for devotion, it's an object of devotion. The Church has not said you shouldn't, use it for your prayer. But it hasn't said, we haven't put our eggs in that basket saying that our faith rises or falls on the Shroud of Turin being authentic. Okay? There were Christians for centuries before there was a Shroud of Turin that was known about. Yes, Peter.
One thing I thought was interesting that Raymond Brown said was that, do you love me more than these, that thing? He said that could also mean, do you love me more than these tasks?
Than these what?
Than these tasks, like fishing, and so it's a calling story.
Ah.
That it's the missing calling story from John.
Do you love me more, not as I tended to present it as, do you love me more than these other disciples?